experience, help building things such as the attended framework, and working other things like ready to go automation. So today we're going to walk you through the attended framework, go through a high level overview of the UiPath forms, and then open it up to Q&A. Anything else on your end, Juan?
Well, thank you, Tuan.
All right, perfect. So as I said, we'll spend about 30 minutes to go through the attended framework. I'll answer any questions that you might have. I want this to be an engaging experience in session. So if you have any questions, feel free to stop me, send messages to the chat, or go ahead and go off on mute. I'm happy to answer any questions and elaborate on anything that you might see. So let's jump into it. So talking about the attended framework. So for many of you, you're probably really familiar with the ReFramework already. The Robotic Enterprise Framework is probably the first framework that UiPath had built. It was made really primarily for unattended automations, had great error handling, the ability to use configs and assets, and a lot of other things that we've improved over the years. Now, you can apply the ReFramework to attended automations, but it lacks some key best practices that we find are conducive to the attended experience. Some of the things are a defined user interface, a way to communicate context to the user throughout the execution, and just an overall consistent user experience from beginning to end. The ReFramework leaves that up to the RPA developer to create, whereas for the attended framework, what we wanted to do is provide a more prescriptive approach to each of these things. And so we created the attended framework to fill these gaps and really to create a structured, consistent, and intuitive approach to creating attended automations. So how does the attended framework do this? We really focus on three key areas or themes. One is user experience, which is probably the most important when it comes to attended automations. Two is utilizing the latest and greatest product functionality in terms of what UiPath has to offer. And three, incorporating elements of the automation program that you yourself are using, but also best practices that we've learned over the years. And we do this by servicing these three areas through four key elements in the attended framework. One is providing a guided experience for end users from beginning to end, regardless of what kind of attended automation they're building. So they know exactly what to expect before, during, and after the automation ends. Next is providing one-click functionality for some of the things that they're going to do most commonly across all their attended automations, emailing errors to support staff, repeating the automation, and configuring things that they want to see in their attended automations. Third is making sure that the automation itself is configurable. What we mean by this is not necessarily design time configurable, but runtime configurable. As a business user, the first time I run an automation, I'll probably interact with it differently than how I would interact with it my second, third, or fourth time running an automation. And so I might want to see an introduction screen. I might want to hide status messages. All these things can be configured through the assistant when you use the attended framework. And last but not least, most importantly to you as an RPA developer is development simplicity. And so we built this on the shoulders of the ReFramework. So if you know how to use the ReFramework, rest assured that you'll be able to pick up the attended framework very, very quickly. And based upon our user testing, users really do prefer the attended framework. Why? They felt like when you use the attended framework compared to both their current experience and also automations built without the attended framework, it makes them more productive. It's more straightforward. It's easier to use the automation. And most importantly, they're more confident when they use the automation, meaning that they will return to these automations again and again. And based upon our MVP reviews, a lot of our MVPs really do feel like it's worth spending a couple hours to learn and get acquainted with the attended framework to really build that world-class attended experience. So what does the user experience look like? From a high level, when you run an automation built using the attended framework, you're going to get a consistent experience from beginning to end. First and foremost, they'll encounter an input form that appears at the beginning of the automation. The form will have the name of the automation, a description of what the automation does, and then a link to any enablement material that you might have, such as a user guide or videos. From there, you'll go ahead and provide any inputs that you need from the end user. They'll fill out those inputs, and then they'll click submit or any other button that you have on your form. After that, the form will close, and then the process or logic of your execution will commence. And from there, you can communicate with the user using a status window that's rendered in the upper left-hand corner. That's rendered at the beginning of the automation, and then you could send and update that message throughout the automation by using a simple IPC activity. Now, once the automation finishes, they'll get a result form at the very end. And depending if it's successful, then they'll get one form, which will contain a message that you can curate yourself, and then have buttons to open up your output folder if your automation creates deliverables, or you can repeat the process to return back to the input form. Now, if the user runs into an error, they'll encounter an error form. The business exception or system exception will be displayed to the end user. And from here, they can click email error. It will open up the default email client with that error pre-populated and the name of the automation. And you can also pre-populate the to address of your support staff. And of course, they can repeat the process if it's a business exception that they can easily fix. Last but not least, we make the automation configurable from the assistant. So the attended framework in the main.xaml will have 3 arguments: hide inputs, which will allow them to hide this input form at runtime; hide messages, which allows them to hide the status window; and hide results, which allows them to hide this result form at the very end. Now, this allows the user to select the speed at which they want to run the automation based upon the familiarity that they have. So if they check all 3 of these, the automation will just jump directly into the process and then exit from the automation without prompting the user for anything. The key attribute of the attended framework is that any selections that the user makes through the form will actually be saved down to a local configuration file and then used on the next execution. So the user's selections will actually be saved in between each execution. The next time they run this automation, this will already be checked. This folder path will already be selected. So they only need to change the things that they actually need to change in between each execution. So with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at a demo of the attended framework and the capabilities that it provides. All right, perfect. So there's just a really quick demo of the functionality for the attended framework. I think it comes to life a lot better when you see a demo. But as you can see, all the elements and functionality that we had talked about is available directly through the attended framework. All you need to do is take your process, an existing process if you'd like, drop it into the process logic of the automation, and everything that you see is automatically implemented for you. So let's look at the user flow that you just saw and how we've structured things in terms of a design pattern. So once you publish the automation, the user will access that automation from the assistant. From there, they can select whether or not they want to run it in picture and whether or not they want to hide any of the forms or messages. As a first-time user, I'm probably not going to make any of those selections. What I'm going to do is go ahead and run the automation. And then what's going to happen when the automation starts is the automation reads in a local configuration file that the user has on their local machine. And that's going to contain any previous execution data that they may have had. And we read that into the config dictionary, which you're probably already familiar with from the ReFramework, and we pipe that into the input form. And so any keys that exist in your dictionary that correspond to field keys in your form will pre-populate with the values from that dictionary. After that, the user will make modifications to the form and then click submit or click button. The automation will go ahead and commence with the process that's associated with that button and then send status messages updates to the user using that status window in the upper left-hand corner. Once the automation is finished, if there was a click activity, that updated config dictionary will be pushed back to the input form, updating, refreshing the form with data that you've gotten from your process. Otherwise, if you have a submit button, it's going to proceed to the result form, which will display results from the execution. And from there, you can repeat the process or end the process. And if you end the process, what's basically going to happen is that config dictionary that you've been using throughout your automation will be written back to the local file and overwrite the config. So next time when you run the automation, that config will basically be read in, and you basically can just continue on from where you left off from the previous execution. And that allows you to maintain context in between each execution. Now, I know we covered a lot. Just want to pause here for a quick second, see if there's any questions related to the attended framework. All right, perfect. So as an RPA developer, what can the attended framework do for me? We wanted to make sure that the developer experience was just as good, if not better, than the user experience when you use the attended framework. And so what we did was we made sure that you had to do the least amount of work possible to integrate and implement the features of the attended framework. And so in the root folder of the template that you download, you're going to just have a few XAMLs, right? One is the config utility.xaml. This is the first XAML that you're probably going to run. You'll notice that we've removed the dependency on Excel from this template. In the ReFramework, you're going to open up Excel, you configure your config file there, you save it, and it reads in during the process. We found that if you're not using Excel otherwise in your workflow, you have an extra dependency that you don't really need. And so we've removed that dependency, and now we ported in your config file directly into a form that you're going to run. So you just run a single file for this, and then you're going to see what exactly looks like the config in Excel, open up in forms, and you could set your config file there. The tabs in this form are going to be tabs that you're familiar with from the config Excel file. We've added two new tabs. One is going to be form defaults. And so as you saw, if you're running an automation using the attended framework, it's going to pre-populate fields in the form with the values from your previous execution. If there are certain fields that you want to reset every single time, you know that there's a password value that you want to clear out, you can select the field key here, and then you could provide the default value. And every time the automation runs, it will set those fields to that default value. Next is an exceptions tab. Here, we've allowed you to define an exception and the language associated with that business exception. So that way, when you run into an exception or you want to throw it in your workflow, you can just call upon this key in the config dictionary, and then it will use that value. Why this is super helpful is because let's say you deploy something to production, and then the user says, this error is helpful, but it's kind of vague or ambiguous as to what it means. You can go in here, change the exception value, and then it'll propagate throughout your entire automation. You don't have to go hunting in your code for where you hard-coded this value. I see there's a question from Bailey. From a performance standpoint, is forms faster than reading an Excel file? Yes, it is. So this form that you open up, you're only going to use at design time. The form doesn't open up at runtime. So what you basically do is you configure this form at design time, you save it. The values from the form are saved to a JSON file, and that JSON file is what's read into your config dictionary when the automation starts up. So the comparison is a JSON file being read into memory faster than looping through an Excel file to read that into memory? And the answer is yes. What's more important is when you write that data back out, you can just overwrite that JSON file instead of having to loop through the Excel file and updating the values. So taking a look at the main.xaml for the attended framework, you'll see that we use state machines very similar to the ReFramework. You're going to have 4 states now, initialize config, where we basically take a look and see if there is a JSON config file on the local machine. If there is, we read it in and we update the values from the form that we selected here. Now, after that, the config is read into memory, and we have our config dictionary. That is going to populate into our input form, and the user makes their selections, they execute their process, and that happens all within this state. Now, once the user is done with their processes, they're going to proceed to the result form, whether it's a business exception, system exception, or successful execution. From here, they're going to get displayed the results, and then they can choose to repeat the process or end the automation. Okay. You'll also notice that there's a cancel transition here. So in our form, every form should have a cancel button. When the user clicks cancel, it's going to go ahead and end the automation without displaying result form. For those asking, you can definitely integrate the ReFramework directly into the attended framework, just as something that will execute as part of a button. And how that works, I will explain right now. So what we've basically done for the attended framework was separate our presentation layer from the process logic of your automation. And so you'll see that what we're taking care of here is this presentation layer, giving you a consistent user experience and a way to pass data in and out of both the forms and your automation between executions. And from the form itself, you'll make buttons on the form that will execute different processes. And so what happens behind that button is totally up to you. It doesn't need to fit a certain design pattern. It could be a sequence. As you can see, you can have another button that executes the flowchart, or even another button that executes the ReFramework, such as one customer who wanted to use the ReFramework to pull down queue items, right, to process in another form. You can do that. What we've done is made the framework agnostic to the process behind the form itself. So you can have a nice, clean form, and the user will always be interacting in a good, concise way with the automation, and whatever's happening underneath the hood is completely hidden from the end user. And that's how we've really structured this to make sure that you have the capability to structure your automation however you want based upon the design pattern of your use case. All right, so we're nearing the end of our attended framework portion of the presentation. So some additional notes and resources. Right now, the attended framework is created for professional developers. As you saw, it's very closely related to the ReFramework. So professional development experience is somewhat needed at this point. We're looking at porting this over for Studio X, but we're waiting for some dependencies and packages available, such as forms, triggers, and other things like that. Right now, the attended framework has been updated to the newest version 2.0, and version 2.0 has no third-party dependencies. So if you're building something using the attended framework, you don't need to worry about your production environment not having access to the marketplace feed or a NuGet feed. All the dependencies that we use right now in the default template use official packages. We do require that you use Studio 21.10 or above or later, just because some of the packages that we're using require that dependency. And then if you're going to download this template directly from the marketplace, you will need a marketplace account. Otherwise, you can access this template from the Studio Backstage view in the template module. Just go ahead and filter for the marketplace feed, and then just look for attended framework, and you should see it right there. If you have feedback, questions, you can always reach out to us on the marketplace page itself. We have a Q&A and feedback section, as well as we have a thread on the UiPath forum for attended framework feedback. So that's the complete section on the attended framework. Wanted to pause here to see if there's any questions before we jump into UiPath forms. All right, so let's go. So for many of you who've used attended automation within UiPath, most likely you've encountered forms at one point or another. What I'd like to do today is walk you through from both an introductory standpoint to an intermediate, almost advanced standpoint of what you can do with forms. So forms is really a way that you can create a user interface for your UiPath automations. Now, this is a local instance of a user interface. It's not something like UiPath apps, which is made for more enterprise-grade single panes of glass. And so if you want to create a simple automation with maybe a few screens that are going to progress between the forms is the answer for you. It's a what you see is what you get tool that allows you to drag and drop different components onto your form canvas to create this user interface to collect data and push data to your users. And so as you can see here, I have an example of UiPath forms. If you've never seen it before, this is just a simple text field and a folder browse activity. I can fill those out and press submit. The way that you would get data from the form, there's two different ways that forms provides. One is data binding. And so you can basically map each of these fields to a variable in your workflow, and that's how you would get the data out, as you can see here. The other way is using JSON output strings. And so when you use JSON output strings, you can provide a string variable. And then when you submit this form, all the JSON data from that form will be basically assigned to this form JSON output string. And then from there, you can deserialize it into a config dictionary or a JSON object and use it throughout your automation. Most people will prefer this method, but there are some setbacks, which I will talk about in just a moment. So components. UiPath form has a ton of components that you can use. We have 4 component categories when you open up the form designer. We have basic components, advanced components, which come underneath basic components, but you'll most likely use them very sparingly. So I haven't included them here just because we don't have that much real estate. But you'll also have layout components, which you'll use to structure and format your form. And then we have a data component, which will allow you to do things like tables and other things that are really important to making sure that you can have an interactive form. So going over some of the common components really quickly, text field is probably very intuitive as to what it is. A text area is similar to a text field, but you can have multiple lines of text. Number, password, checkbox, select boxes, labels. You'll probably use file and folder browses very often. Drop downs, radios, and buttons. Now for the layouts, you most likely will use columns a lot, and you'll use panels. Now there's 2 ways there's 2 ways to nest components or elements in your form. One is panels and one is containers. Why you would want to nest other components is, let's say you want to hide certain portions of your form based upon selections in the beginning of it. You can have all of the components that you want to unhide or hide basically dragged inside a panel or container, and then you could hide that panel or container based upon selections. And I'll go through an example in just a bit. What I would recommend, based upon my experience, is using a panel to hide and unhide things rather than a container. There is one exception, which I'll go through, but I recommend using panels just because it's easier to use. You can use a table layout if you want to structure things. I found that table layouts are easier to manipulate than columns when you're trying to get things in a certain way. And then, of course, we have tabs. So this is going to look like a folder structure where you can click on a tab and it will show different views. I don't really use tabs because it gets a little bit funky when it comes to when you want to hide or unhide certain values or even disabling buttons on the form. That leaves us with our data category. The data category is a little bit unique because I feel like it contains components that don't really fit anywhere else. The first one is hidden. So the hidden component might on its surface not seem very useful because when you drag it on, it's basically just like a label that's always hidden. But what it does is it contains a value. And what you can do then is you can set that value and then have other components hide or unhide depending on the value in that hidden component. So let's say I bring a hidden component into my form and I can assign it a value, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And I have 5 different panels on my form. What I can say is panel 1, I want you to unhide when the hidden component equals 1. Panel 2, I want you to unhide when the hidden component equals 2. And then only that panel will show based upon the number that the hidden component possesses. And so what you can do is you can have your automation just manipulate what value is in this hidden component, and then it will hide and unhide different panels in your form. The last 2 things that I'll say with the data category is the data grid and edit grid. This will allow you to create rows in your form. So let's say if you're adding files or you want to allow your user to create a list of things, you would do that with the data grid or edit grid. And from there, you can actually modify specific rows or remove them. So taking a look at the options that you have for a component after you drag them onto the canvas. So the first one is going to be your display tab. This is going to be everything that the user sees. So you can create a label for your component. You can position that label. There'll be placeholders and descriptions, and then tooltip. most people ask me, if I'm looking at a component and I want to provide more details to my end user, which one should I use? Should I use a placeholder? Should I use the descriptions? Should I use a tooltip? Just so you know, the description acts like a label. It's just another line that you can put. And so what I would recommend is keeping your labels very short, directly as to what this field pertains to. So if you want the user to select an output folder for their PDFs, you can just name this label output folder. You don't need to say PDF output folder. And then use the tooltip, because this will be hidden unless they hover over it, to say, select the folder for where your PDFs will be generated. That's how I would approach it. And then down here, you can make selections such as hidden, which will hide the component when the form first appears. The reason why you would do this is because you may want to unhide it later, depending on a condition that you have. You can hide the label in case you don't want it. You always will have to provide a label, but you can hide it if you don't need it. We can show the word counter, etc. We can disable it. So disable is something that I use as well. Let's say I have a field that I want to display something to the end user, like a result, but it's not necessarily a field that they're going to edit or submit afterwards. I would just set disabled and then use it as like a result field or a summary field. A couple of questions that came through. If I'm running in picture-in-picture and a form appears, will it show in the picture or on the machine? Great question. We're actually going to go through that in our tips and tricks section, but depending on where you are, it will show in picture-in-picture. So there's a way around that to make sure that your form will appear in your main session, even if you're running your process in picture-in-picture, and that will be on the next slide or next 2 slides. Is it possible to pre-populate a grid for user review and make edits? Yes, you definitely can. One of our common form patterns is the ability to pre-populate a grid so that you can view results. But you can do the same way if you want to make edits. All you need to do is pass in the data table as a JArray, and it will pre-populate. So anything that you see on your form, you can pre-populate before the form renders, and you can update, and then you can submit. There's a way to do that, and I will show you how to do it easily. Now, the next tab that I think is really important, it's not in chronological order or even in sequential order, is the field key. So the field key is important because this is how you will communicate or know which field to pull the data from. So even though your label might be something totally different, the field key is what's important because this is what's basically going to map to your data bindings or map to your config file. So whatever you name the field key, make sure that you remember it easily. And it is case sensitive. And so if I had text field here, but I was trying to map it with a capital T, it won't recognize that. So make sure that you have a consistent standard naming convention. Next is validation. Validation is important because if you have a field that's required, you can check it here. And then the user basically won't be able to submit certain buttons on your form if you've made it so that the user can't submit without requiring or without filling out some required fields. So let's say your automation has an output folder that they have to fill out. You can go in here, check required, and the user won't be able to submit that form until they fill this out. It's always important to be able to do as much client-side validation or upfront validation as you can so that the user can basically jump straight into the process with valid inputs. Next, last but not least, we have conditional. And so this is basically where you would hide or unhide this particular component. So if I had a panel here, I could say this component should display true, which should mean unhide when the form component, such as hidden, right, has the value 1. So this is how you would hide and unhide other things based upon the value that another component has. A lot of people will use this. This is probably the easiest way that you could hide and unhide certain components or large sections of your form. There's more complicated ways to do it. That's really where advanced logic and advanced conditions and logic come in if you have, let's say, multiple conditions. But most of the time, you'll be able to do what you need just using this simple logic. All right, one thing that I didn't cover is the data tab. So the data tab I didn't cover because each component does it very differently. But where you'll really use the data tab is if you have a component with multiple items like a checkbox or let's say a drop-down list or a radio button. That's really where you would put your individual items, right? How they correspond. But otherwise, you probably won't use the data tab that much. The one component that I wanted to take a look at a little more closely is the button component. So when you drag a button component in, obviously you do all these things, but you're also going to select an action for the button. So the two that I really use a lot is submit and click. And how the behavior of your form reacts will depend on which action you select. By default, it will be submit. So when you click submit, it tells the form close and then execute what's in the do block. All right. So that basically means I'm done with the form. I don't need it anymore. I want you to continue execution. Now, if you set it to a click action, it basically tells the form, don't close the form, but execute what's inside the do block. And so this is where you basically have, let's say, multiple buttons on your form. You probably have a bunch of click buttons that are going to go retrieve data using an API or do other things and refresh the data on the form. And then you might have one submit button at the very end, which is going to close the form and end the automation. And so those are just two key things to keep in mind. If you've never used forms before, that's going to be really helpful and save you a lot of headache. So taking a look at some tips and tricks. So as I mentioned, one of the key things that's a little bit troublesome about forms is there's two real conventional ways to get data in and out of the form. One is data bindings, right? Where you're going to take each field in your form and then you're going to map it to a variable in your workflow. So it's a one-for-one, basically, mapping. This allows you to push and pull data multiple times in the form. And so I can pass in data to this text field and I can pass in a folder path before it begins. And then once I make selections, I can pass them back out to these variables. And if this was a click button, I could do something with those variables and I could push that data back in and update it with new data. Data binding allows you to do that. It allows you to have in and out directions. Now, the other way to get data out of your form and into your form as well is using this JSON string. And so let's say if you're using the Attended Framework or even the ReFramework and you have your config dictionary, you can turn that config dictionary, you could serialize it into a JSON string, and then you could pass it into your form. Now, that means that if there's any keys in your dictionary that correspond to field keys in your form, then the value in the dictionary will go ahead and be pre-populated. Okay, so you can use, let's say, a dictionary to pre-populate the form. You don't need to do any mappings. I'm just passing in the entire object. Now, when you want to get data back out, you can pass it back out as well as a JSON string. And then all you need to do is transform that back into your dictionary or use it as a JObject, right? Pushing in, pushing out very easily. And it's easy setup and maintenance because I don't need to do any data bindings. The problem with that is that you really only get one shot for each. You can pass data in when the form first renders, but you can't really refresh the data. If I had click buttons and whatnot, every time the data doesn't get passed in after it initially renders. So you're kind of left with static data, okay? And you can get the data out. And so this approach is really good if you're just displaying a form to a user and then you're getting data and then the form is closing. It's not good if you're grabbing data and you want to update the form. How people have gotten around this in the past is they would display a form, get data from the user, close the form, do some logic, display another form, et cetera, et cetera. So they're basically treating each screen as a different form. Now, this is an okay approach. What actually happens is you're going to get really bad performance impact here because each time the form closes and re-renders, it has a small memory impact on your computer. So the best approach really is to put everything into one form and refresh it, right? But how do you do this without making it tedious? So what we found and what we use in the Attended Framework is you drag in a container. And like I said, this is the only time that I really recommend using a container, a single container into your form designer. And then you're going to put all of your components into this container. So basically you have this umbrella container or this parent container that contains everything. And then what you're going to do is in your data bindings, you're just going to map that container to an in-out direction object variable. And you just specify this. And what this allows you to do is you can push and pull data multiple times, refresh the data in your form multiple times, and you don't need to do any complex data bindings. It works almost exactly like this, right? But it does it so that you can refresh the data multiple times without having to close and open the form again. Now, if you do this approach, there's a moderate setup that is required. And basically, what you need to do is create a container object because an object is being passed to this object component or the container component. And if you already have a config dictionary that you're using in your framework or your automation, you would assign that dictionary to the object and then just pass that object directly into the form. And any keys in that object that relate to field keys in your form will be pre-populated with values from that object or dictionary. When it comes back out, it's going to be, once again, an object. We need to serialize that object and then deserialize it into a dictionary. It sounds a little bit funky, but we basically need to turn it into a JSON string and then turn it back into a config dictionary. But that way, you can basically just pass data in and out really quickly, update data in your form, and you don't need to close it. This way, you can have one form activity, multiple screens refreshing all the time, and you don't need to create a ton of data bindings for each field. It's really, really helpful, really, really easy. So a few things, and I think this is going to answer some of the questions that came through the chat. And so if you are running in picture-in-picture and a form appears, where will it appear? Now, if you build your workflow and everything is in one workflow without any invokes, and you have a form in the middle, then if the user selects, or if you set to the automation to run in picture-in-picture, everything will happen in your picture-in-picture window. And then when it gets to the form, that form will appear in picture-in-picture. How you can get around this is take your form activity and then just extract it as its own workflow. When you do that, you can set the workflow to be invoked as an isolated process, and then you could tell it which session you want to be invoked in. And you can set this to main, okay? And so what this basically does is, even though the process is running in picture-in-picture, now the form will appear in your main session. And what you want to make sure is when you're passing the data back out from the form, you pass it back out to the main session that was running in picture-in-picture. So there's a little bit of finagling that you have to do to make sure that the process is still executing in picture-in-picture, because what people will most likely do is display this form and then continue building their process in the do block, right? You don't want to do that, because if the form is displaying in the main session and your activities in the do block are in this workflow, then your automation will continue in your main session. What you want is only for the form to appear in the main session and then continue execution in picture-in-picture, okay? And that's how you do it. Now, forms with multiple screens. As I mentioned, it's going to be easier initially to just create different forms for different screens. Most people do it just because it's easier to maintain, right? But again, it's not going to be a great user experience, because forms will appear, they'll disappear, users won't know what to expect. So it's easier just to build one screen, and the Attended framework provides a good structure for this. And then each screen that you have within that form, just surround it with a panel. So as you can see here, this is an automation that we created. What it's going to do is walk the user through downloading a template. After they complete the template, generate an Excel input file from that template. And from then, they're going to use both the input file and the completed template to create emails, right? This is a guided process. And so what we wanted to do is, when the automation appears, show them just this screen. When they click download template, it's going to take them to this screen. When they click generate input file, then it will take them to this screen, right? And so that way you can have a single form, multiple screens that kind of progress through. And you can't see it, but right up here, we're using that hidden component to set which panel should be showing. Now, one other question that we had through the chat was, is it possible to pre-populate a grid for user review and make edits? So that is a common pattern that I'm actually going to show in the next slide. Sorry about that. But the last thing I wanted to show is form cancellation. So a good best practice is to have a cancel button in your form. When the user clicks cancel, it's going to close the form but not execute the process. The one thing that you have to keep in mind is that the form not only has cancel buttons, it also has this X button in the upper right-hand corner. If the user clicks X, it's almost like they're pressing cancel. And so you want to be able to handle that. In the properties of the form, there is an output of dismissed. This will be a Boolean variable that you can assign. And then from here, right after the form, you could say, did the user dismiss the form without selecting a button? Yes, then do what you may. Probably the most likely thing is just end the automation. I don't want to execute the process because there's not any data in the form. All right, so common patterns. Taking a look really quickly at common patterns that we have. One is selecting files. So this is used in one of our ready-to-go automations. Users want to be able to see which files they're going to process. Initially, when we approached ready-to-go automations, we had two options that user had. You can select a single file to process, or you can select a folder. Now, the file option is great, but let's say if they want to process multiple files, then they'll have to go for the folder option, and that requires some pre-processing on the user's end. Not to mention, if they want to select things from multiple folders, they're going to have to actually run this automation multiple times. Not a great user experience. And so what we've done is create an approach where the user can actually see which files are going to be processed and allow them to do either through a single form. And so right here we have a panel. This is basically a data grid. It's going to initialize empty. And when the user clicks add file, they'll be able to add a single file, or they can add a folder and then select the folder and add the contents from that folder. Once they do that, that file or the contents from the folder will be added to this list or data grid. And then they can just delete the ones that they don't want, or they can add more as they see fit. And this is a much better experience because now they only have to run the automation once and they know exactly what they're going to process. We have an example of this that I can share as well, or you can download the Manage My PDF Files automation off the marketplace and take a look at that example. Next is the guided walkthrough. So this is probably one that's going to come up again and again. You want to make sure that you're providing a guided experience for your users from beginning to end. You want to make sure that you create a systematic, consistent way to do that. And so the hurdle that we had was, I have an automation where the user needs to prepare inputs, but the next time they run this automation, they're probably not going to have to prepare those inputs again. I want them to be able to jump directly to the part in the automation where they can just create the documents or the presentations or the emails. And so the way that we work through this with design is when the automation starts, the user has two options that are dictated through radio buttons. One is I need to prepare inputs, and one is I already have inputs. Now, if the user is new to the automation, they obviously need to prepare inputs. They'll select that radio button, and then the first panel in this walkthrough will appear. Select the output folder, click download template. The next panel will appear where they're going to generate the input file from the email template, and etc. Now, at the very end, they're going to get to this screen, which is the same thing as I already have inputs, right? Where they'll provide the input file and the email template that they've completed, and then click create emails to process and create those emails. The next time they run the automation, they already have inputs. They don't want to go through the entire process again. They can click I already have inputs and go ahead and generate those files. They don't need to go through the entire walkthrough again. And again, this is really close and really aligns with the ability to provide configuration to the user at runtime. Last but not least, execution results. So most of the time, you'll tell the user automation is complete, and then they're really on their own to go and see what actually happened, making sure that things have actually processed accordingly. Now, what we've done in a result form for some of our ready-to-go automation is create a table which will show them exactly what happened to each file as they're going through it. And so as you can see here, as a user, I can come in here and say, for this file, I extracted 2 pages. For this file, I extracted 1 page. And they can see certain pages have issues, right? But this gives them a summarized view. And I know one of the questions in the chat was, can you pre-populate a grid where the user can make reviews and edits? You definitely can. This is the approach that I would recommend. What's happening here is I've made this table disabled, meaning that they can't edit it, but you can enable the table and they can make edits as they see fit. Where that's really common is, let's say I've generated a bunch of files, but I also want the user to be able to rename them. They can come in here and see the recommended file name and then just type in and edit the file name as they see fit, click submit, and then I'll rename those files for them. So populating and presenting something for the user to make suggestions and edits, totally and completely a valid use case for the attended framework and for forms. All right, so almost to the end. Some just additional notes. Forms 2.0.2 was just released. If you are on UiPath version 22.4.4 or lower, I don't recommend using this form activity package just yet. Instead, use 1.9.6, which has almost the same functionality. There are a couple of dependency issues that we were able to fix in 22.4.5, and which will be fixed in 22.10 as well. But if you're not on that version, you might run into some issues. Even if you don't encounter it yourself on your own computer, your production users may. And so just to be safe, if you know that any of your users in production are running on 22.4 or lower, just use forms 1.9.6 for now. And then once you upgrade to 22.10, feel free to upgrade to 2.0.2. For all the things that you've seen today, they're available on the marketplace via our Ready to Go automations. Feel free to take a look at Ready to Go automations if you need inspiration or examples on how to do certain things. And in terms of the roadmap, we're looking at making forms a first-class activity. So instead of just a simple activity you drag onto your campus, something that you'll be able to configure at the project level, which will allow you to integrate with workflows and triggers a lot easier. So you can map, let's say, a sub workflow to certain buttons on the form, and then also making that approach for multiple screens much easier. So maybe you'll just be able to create multiple forms in your workflow, and then we'll use the same process. You won't have that performance impact that we talked about. And that really is it that I had for the session. I really wanted to leave some time for Q&A. I know there's some questions that came through the chat already, but now I wanted to open up the floor for any additional questions, feedback, comments that you may have, and I hope you enjoyed the session. All right, Juan, I don't know if there's any other questions or comments coming through the chat. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I think we are good to go. Juan, do you want to take over and stop the recording?
Yes.